Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Good afternoon, Tom.
Matt, AI accountability. What have you been thinking about in that arena recently?
I will say, Tom, I have not been thinking about it as much as a certain regulator whose recent speech on this subject caught my eye. This was Michael Hsu. He is the head of the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, so banking regulator. Mr. Hsu is essentially the chief consumer banking regulator in the United States. And last week, he gave a speech at a conference sponsored by, and I believe organized by, the Financial Stability Oversight Council. So that's like this conclave of financial and banking regulators in the United States. They meet quarterly to talk about systemic financial system risks. The FSOC, they were created after the financial crisis of 2008. And so the Oversight Council put together this event to discuss artificial intelligence's risks to the financial sector. And along comes Mr. Hsu from the OCC, and he gives this speech that I thought was very insightful about the problems with artificial intelligence right now, that he clearly is looking at it from a banking industry lens. But if you really pay attention to what he is saying about the current shortcomings of artificial intelligence and our oversight of AI, he gets to some really good points that are worthwhile for anybody in any industry thinking about how your company will adopt artificial intelligence, which, by the way, is all companies. But his basic premise is that right now we don't have a system of accountability for when AI goes wrong. If you can't have that system of accountability, then parties involved in using AI ultimately won't trust the AI. And then if you're not trusting the AI, like, why are we doing this, people? Because if we're developing a technology, we can't trust that it's telling us the truth or working the way it's supposed to, or we can't understand what it's doing, we can't duplicate its results, we're not going to do it. And so that was the gist of Mr. Hsu's speech. We can break down some of his good insights later on, but really it is something worth taking the time to read and digest if you are in charge of developing AI, if you are working with the people at your company developing AI, and your job is to help them develop it smartly, thinking about it in a risk-aware manner, trying to anticipate potential regulation of AI down the road. Then his speech, which is only about 6 or 7 pages, easy to read, it's definitely something worth your time.
Mine, it strikes me that there's a couple of different things going on here, and I'm going to focus on accountability because I see accountability with my background in the legal context. Are you accountable for what your company puts out using generative AI? And in your blog post, which of course we'll link to in the show notes, you talk about Air Canada, who had a bot that gave an answer that was incorrect that caused a customer to have a loss, which they were able to get recompense for. I see that as a natural outcome. If Air Canada puts it out, then Air Canada is responsible for it. No matter where it may have been generated for, if it's going out over the Air Canada side, I think 100% of the time, that's Air Canada's responsibility, and doesn't bother me one iota if they're responsible, even if they can't figure out where it came from.
That's interesting because the Air Canada example, and I'll unpack that in a moment for listeners. That's something I wrote about when it happened earlier this year. And it, by coincidence, was the primary example Mr. Hsu gave in his speech. So here's what happened. It's not just that Air Canada was using a chatbot that gave a customer bad advice about fare refunds. It's that the chatbot really invented a new policy for Air Canada without telling anyone about how this customer by the name of John Moffat, he was looking to get a emergency airfare for a death in the family. And the chatbot said, yeah, you can go ahead and book it and then just apply for a bereavement discount later and you'll get it. And that's not Air Canada's policy. And so he applied for it and he didn't get it. And then he said, what the hell? And he ultimately took Air Canada to court, and a tribunal earlier this year said just what you said, Tom. It's like, this is a part of the Air Canada extended enterprise. So therefore, you, Air Canada, must refund the consumer. And Mr. Moffat got several $100s plus fees and costs and things like that. From a legal standpoint, that all makes sense. The challenge here is that from a technology standpoint, Tom, what you said at the very end there, that's the sticking point, is that Air Canada couldn't figure out how the chatbot did this. What possessed it to create a new policy? And the problem is that Air Canada really isn't equipped to figure that out and to be able to correct it. The people who could correct it, and this is where the details matter, would be the technology company whose large language model was the brain power, the source code for this chatbot. So basically, we have technology companies who are developing these AI systems. Companies come along, take the AI system, and then layer on their specific application on top of it. And they're assuming that the AI will give good advice, do what is supposed to happen, and sometimes it doesn't. But that leads us to this bizarre situation where legally Air Canada is responsible for this, but technologically, Air Canada can't fix this problem. So ultimately, it would have to be fixed by the large language learning tech company that built this. But that's not really how our legal system is configured right now. And we're talking about these examples, and we could give some others that seem rather straightforward and innocuous because they're all about consumer protection issues and consumer protection harm. And Mr. Hot Moffat, the consumer, was harmed. We know how to rectify consumer harms. And ultimately, most consumer harms are not going to be all that much money. But a regulator, like a banking regulator, like the OCC, like Mr. Hsu, they're in charge of systemic risks. This is what they worry about. What if some AI comes along in the banking system and causes a liquidity crisis akin to what we saw in 2008? And $8 trillion worth of equity value is lost by the U.S. consuming public. And unemployment goes up to 10.5%. Like, how are we going to assign responsibility for that? Because any company where legally you might say, you company, you're on the hook for this, they're just going to say, we're bankrupt and in ruins. Okay. But meanwhile, unemployment is still 10%. We still lost $8 trillion of value. The whole country's fallen apart. Taxpayers have to bail us out by $700 billion, just like what happened before. Like, that is not going to be the time to apply these more traditional legal structures of accountability to what could be a colossal mess beyond all human comprehension. We have to figure out these accountability systems before something like that happens. And the trick is, with AI, we don't know how something colossal like that might happen, but it doesn't seem far-fetched. And that was Mr. Hsu's basic point, is that we need to do better at coming up with a model of accountability for AI right now so that the potentially huge risks it could cause are going to be more well understood, and we'll have a better sense of who is responsible for that now, because therefore those companies who might be responsible for it would say, oh, yikes, we really need to double down on our risk management and controls today, rather than the AI-caused financial apocalypse of 2027 or something like that. That's where he was going with this. And he raises a good point that what's possible with technology and what is enforceable by law, currently they don't add up or they don't align in a way that is commensurate with the potential risk.
I guess, Matt, I see the legal framework as robust enough to answer the question of accountability and assign liability to whoever put that out. Now, that company may be bankrupt and the catastrophic consequences may be great to require a government bailout, but that's essentially what we had in '07. And accountability doesn't seem to me to be the issue. I guess I see it more in explainability of how the AI is operating. And that's what Air Canada didn't have visibility into, and their subcontractor who provided that. So having something called explainable AI seems to me at least one avenue that we could look down or look towards.
The problem is with that is that avenue currently does not exist, nor do we know how to build it right now. And that brings us to another example that Mr. Hsu gave in his speech. This was more of a personal anecdote that he was talking about, but he had a conversation with a bank CEO, and they had certain set procedures that their human employees used to make decisions about extending credit to consumers. And there was a certain population of consumers, they looked and they said, no, this person is not a good credit risk. We humans have decided not to extend the credit. They took that population of people who didn't get credit, and then they gave it to an AI the bank was using. And the AI came back and said, no, you can extend credit to a lot of these people. But the bank CEO couldn't figure out why. And there was no way to explain the AI's decision. There was no avenue there of explainability that they could look down. We humans couldn't figure it out. What are you supposed to do with that fact? Are you supposed to say, no, then we're not going to extend credit? We're using our human judgment, which increasingly feels questionable because AI is increasingly better than humans at some judgment tasks than we are. And we don't know if this is one of them or not. So what if you don't extend that credit and you're leaving money on the table? What if you do extend that credit, but for some reason the AI was wrong and you're not going to figure that out until you learn that lesson the hard way 4 or 5 or 6 quarters down the road? Who might be sued for that? What if you were publicly traded? Do the investors sue you because you didn't try to take that business? Or did the investors sue you because you did listen to the AI and you should have known better? But we can't explain the AI right now. So it's easy to say that explainability of AI is important because it is. The problem is we don't know where that road is. We do not have that road. So I would just read off one quote here from Mr. Hsu's speech that I think is kind of on point with it, although he's talking more about the Air Canada example. Today with AI, the companies most capable of affecting outcomes have limited responsibility for them. For instance, the ability of Air Canada to fix its chatbot pales in comparison to the ability of the AI platform that runs the large language model upon which the chatbot was built. Yet Air Canada was the one held responsible for its chatbot misinforming the consumer. Now, all of that is correct. All of that makes sense. All of that is not really that big of a deal because we're talking about maybe $800 or $900 US money, not even Canadian money, for to make whole this harmed consumer. It's easy to say we can handle this with the examples we've seen so far. But Mr. Hsu is not wrong to be worrying about the potential other consequences down the road. And right now, we don't have the ability to, say, explain the AI. But that gets to his point. Shouldn't somebody be held accountable for that? That we don't have the explainability? Is it the company using the app? Or is it the tech platform that built it without explainability? Is it some other party? The one person who knows he doesn't want to be responsible is the government when all of this goes wrong and we have a tremendous bill and we have to have a taxpayer bailout. So this is why regulators are thinking about these accountability models, because if we don't have one, then ultimately when everything hits the fan, the taxpayer will be the one cleaning up the mess. He would rather people be more cleanly about these things before anything hits the fan. And that's where his speech came from.
I guess I'm less concerned because I'm fairly certain we can develop that interpreted learning models, whether it's a decision tree, whether it's a linear model or whatever it may be. But back to the accountability, it seems to me that should always be the point of contact with the consumer. Now, Air Canada can look back and should look back, and hopefully, if they've drafted their contracts right, they can legally look back to the company who's responsible. But you should always have the point of contact, the company that delivers it to the consumer should be liable to the consumer, and the consumer should be able to point to that company and say, they damaged me. I don't care how they damaged me or what led to the damage, but they're going to recompense me. So I guess flow back or flow down liability is the way a large number of claims work, all the way back from product liability to FCPA. It just strikes me that the framework's in place until we can get the tech wound up to answer some of the questions that you posed in your blog post.
I think that is a nice theory, and I agree with the theory. It raises some useful questions for compliance officers to think about. Like, do we have all of our contract for all of this lined up and structured correctly so that we can do this chain of accountability all the way down? And the problem that technology specifically poses is that a lot of tech now can be rented at a very low cost very easily. And Do you, the compliance officer or the chief procurement officer, do you know, or the chief technology or IT security officer, do you know what your employees are actually doing with AI? Because what if they just pull out a payment card and rent AI as a platform or AI as a service for $10.95 a month to run a chatbot, to build it and experiment with it, see how it goes? Because yes, they could do that. They could use ChatGPT pretty much for free, but do you, the company, do you have the proper policies in place to tell them they shouldn't do that? Do you have the right training to show them that this is a really bad idea, even when you ignore the policy and try and do it anyways? Do you have the right controls in place on your payment card, perhaps, to be able to block these sort of transactions? Do you have the right IT security measures in place to detect that an AI system is touching your data? And we can go on and on from there. My point being that there are a lot of very practical IT controls that need to be in place that A, I think compliance officers might not always be fully aware of. B, the IT people who do know about these controls don't know what the compliance risks are. And like just C, this is going to become an increasingly important thing for corporate compliance. It's going to be more about how your employees are interacting with technology because it can spawn a tremendous number of consumer protection risks, legal liability, regulatory enforcement, and it could be quite difficult to implement all of that. Now, all of that said, Mr. Hsu did come up with an alternative theory of accountability, Tom, that I would want to take a few minutes to explore because this is not the first time the corporate world has encountered this sort of tricky accountability problem. And he came up with what I thought was a potential solution.
And what is that solution?
I waited for the dramatic pause there. The solution that he pointed to was just actually something that cloud services have been grappling with for what, if it's 2024, the better part of 15 or 20 years now, is that large amounts of corporate technology now is not actually developed and owned and run and possessed by a company, by your company. You rent out most of your IT resources from somewhere else. You use Salesforce, which is housed on data storage provided by Amazon Web Services, and the data might be stored somewhere else by a separate cloud provider. And it all works very seamlessly for your sales team to be using Salesforce to send out sales pitches to your customer base, that kind of a thing. Do you, the company, want to have complete control, which means you own all of the layers of the technology stack? You own it. It's on your equipment, on your property. You're controlling it. You're responsible for it all the way down, and you get to do whatever you want with it because it's yours. You could go that way. That is one model of non-shared responsibility. You have all the responsibility. Here in the real world, though, there's more of a sliding scale. And Mr. Hsu actually cooked up an interesting chart that I have on my blog that shows there can be other layers of that technology stack that you rent. And depending on exactly what you're renting, you're in charge of some of those concerns and risks, but others are covered by the provider of the service or the technology. There's platform as a service, there's infrastructure as a service, there's software as a service. If you swing all the way to the extreme, you could have all of your software, all of your hardware, all of the middleware is all rented from somewhere else. So you have almost no control over how the technology serves you, but you don't have any of the risks because the risks are all assumed by those people providing the service. So they're in charge of the data security controls. They're in charge of the data privacy controls. And if you have structured your contracts correctly, as you said, Tom, when something goes wrong, they're the ones who have to pay for cleaning up the mess. And it is this sort of sliding scale from left to right of total control versus no control and total risk versus no risk. And that's what you need to think about. With the shared services model for cloud computing, the shared responsibility model, that works fairly well so far. And Mr. Hsu said we need to get something like that for artificial intelligence apps because most companies aren't going to invent their own artificial intelligence. They're going to rent it from somewhere else. So how do you think through what exactly are you going to make them responsible for? And what are you going to be responsible for? What will regulators say about who is responsible for what? Because ultimately, this shared responsibility model will need the blessing of regulators, or else they're going to come up with their own interpretation and force it upon you. So he's gave an example of how we might get out of this while we are trying to develop the right sort of artificial intelligence capabilities around explainable results, repeatable results, legal responsibility for AI's hallucinations, and things like that. It was a very good, thoughtful speech about how we can think through ultimately how AI is going to interact with us. It's not the same as cloud computing. It's more complicated than cloud computing. So our shared services model only goes so far. But he's not wrong to say if we don't figure this out, then we will be in a constant litigation game of whack-a-mole that AI has done something wrong. So now I'm going to sue somebody here and somebody there to get my recompense. And that mm, intersection of high litigation costs as we sort out responsibility and an inability to trust that what AI is doing for you is really going to work. If we can't solve those two problems, we are not going to embrace AI the way that we could and the way that we should, because AI could solve a lot of human problems and could alleviate a lot of burdens. But if we don't get it into a place where companies can trust the AI that they're using and understand who is accountable for what, then this is going to go the way of the Betamax video cassette. It's not going to fly very long. And that was his point with his speech. And it was a very good, thought-provoking discussion of the issues that we need to figure out.
I have to say, after this podcast, I'm even more convinced we have an appropriate legal liability framework in place, number one. And number two, that it's the explainability, because I think your point on trust is spot on. You can't trust the AI, which you can't now. It's not going to be much use to really anyone. That's where I shake at after all this.
We shall see.